many of us here have some connection to the Franciscan family, I assume so. Some may not, of course. I think a couple of the people, many of the people I invited may have little relation to religion, but are here interested in how Franciscans understand the world and how we understand this particular situation of an environmental climate crisis. And I hope I'm not trying to speak for all Franciscans here. In fact, I'm only speaking for myself, but I would hope that this is something that allows all of us in the Franciscan family, to one extent or another, to think about where we are in this situation. Because it is the Franciscan School of Theology that is hosting and very graciously sponsoring this. So off we go. For the Franciscans on board listening to us now, you're all aware that, well, our concern right now this year seems to be the Canticle of the Creatures. As many Franciscans know, that turns 800 this year. St. Francis of Assisi wrote it in 1225. And so there are numerous events going on, and you might have attended some of those yourself or zoomed in on those numerous events commemorating that monumental work. The Canticle of the Creatures is probably the document that earned Francis of Assisi his role as the patron saint of ecologists. His concern for the natural environment, God's creation in his world, in his time, stands 800 years later. But amid all of this celebration, of course, it kind of pales in comparison to the sorts of things that are going on, at least in our country. We're also concerned that we have an administration that is very avowedly not on board with issues of climate and doesn't take them quite as seriously as many of us do. And we see those headlines, and those are drowned out daily by other roller coaster right of headlines that take us all over the map, most recently tariffs. So our attention has been pulled away from not just the Canticle of the Creatures, but the issue of climate change and what we need to do about it in general. We know from recent headlines and recent cable news and other news coverage that it is a pressing issue. We are seeing the effects of it. Wildfires, most recently in California, last year in Canada, resounding effects. Hurricanes are getting worse. For a while, the NOAA last year was considering adding a category 6 hurricanes, because category 5 didn't seem to cover it anymore. We had Hurricane Milton last year wreaking havoc. And we have heat domes, heat waves, now called domes because they settle over a particular geographic region and sit there, unlike before where you would have a few warm days in a row. A heat dome seems to be a product of climate change, and that can, as we've seen, literally bring about death, especially for the elderly and the infirm. A lot of issues facing us. For better or worse, I think we have to acknowledge that St. Francis's Canticle and St. Francis of Assisi himself was ahead of his time. It was ahead of its time. And I say for worse because, well, there is that gap there. Francis of Assisi lived late 12th century into the early 13th century. The Canticle was written in 1225. That's, of course, 600 years or so before the Industrial Revolution. And it's the Industrial Revolution that we are living with now, the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Every time we talk about pollution, every time we talk about CO2 emissions and the causes of climate change, what we're talking about are the effects of a very profound watershed period in economic development, where we decided to produce industrially, and that has its consequences. And we got to acknowledge St. Francis and the Canticle and all of St. Francis's work could never imagine the world that we live in right now. Could never imagine the sorts of things we struggle with due to the Industrial Revolution, the consequences of it, and certainly couldn't imagine the rise in Earth's temperature. Global warming, as it used to be called, now climate change, because the warming of the planet can lead to a lot of different effects. Not all of them feel like warmth or warming. Francis was well ahead of this. So we have to kind of extrapolate what Francis of Assisi said. And if we're going to find it helpful to us, put it in a modern context. Unfortunately, we have help with that. This Francis, who takes his name quite literally from Francis of Assisi, knows all too well what that world is like. And he's written about it in depth. And I hope at least some of us who are viewing this now and participating in this discussion have looked at his writings, Laudato Si, the encyclical from 2015, Laudate Deum, a apostolic exhortation, a little bit shorter from just a few years ago. This is a very modern, very Franciscan statement on what's going on. And the question I think I want to ask is, are we really hearing him? We say we listen to Pope Francis, and many of us have read Laudato Si, and we've gone to things like this, Zoom conferences and webinars. We've gone to days of recollection. We've done all of these things at the parish level for us Catholics, but whatever the context, people have said, yes, I hear the message of Laudato Si. Well, do we is the question. That's the question I want to put forth tonight. Or do we take a different approach, kind of burying our head? And there's reason to be that cynical, I think. I'm going to leave us, I hope, in a state of something other than cynicism, but I think we have to contend with the fact that there is a reason for cynicism, and we have to overcome that. So, in order to do that, let's try a thought experiment. In fact, let's make it a time travel thought experiment. Since we don't have a time machine, we have a DeLorean in our imagination. So we can get on board with Marty McFly and Doc there and get in the car, Marty, as he says. We're going to take it back to 1985. Imagine indeed, if you would, that it is April 10th, not 2025, but 1985. This is a world that does not yet know Back to the Future. It's 3 months before the release of Back to the Future, April 10th. I'm sure a lot of people that are joining us tonight have memories of this. A few of you may have been born later, but if you think back, We Are the World was the #1 song. This was before Kenny Rogers had any work done, so he looks a little different there. And we're 2 weeks away, in April 10th, 1985, we're 2 weeks away from the celebration of the 15th Earth Day. First Earth Day was celebrated April 22nd, 1970. It's a long story in history. We won't go into it. But by 1985, we've had 15 of these, 15 days devoted to the thought, to some reflection on the state of the planet and what we can do to try to help it and try to ameliorate the crises that even then we're building. On April 10th, 1985, the German Green Party for 2 years had already had members in the German Bundestag, the German legislature, actually participating in government in 1985. And this guy looks really surprised here, like he's not quite sure he should be there, but he is there. And 26 of his colleagues were there also. So there was an active role for people. It was called the Green Movement back then. I was part of it. I was part of the initial Green organization that became the Green Party in the Chicago area. This was a very heady time. The mood was optimism. And I can think back and remember this was optimism. We would think, oh, yeah, there's problems. There is tough stuff ahead, but there is a movement here. Global environmental problems and the related problems that come from it are being taken seriously. They're electing people in Germany and other places to actually make laws to address this. It's entered mainstream politics. Hippies in Germany are sitting on legislate. This gotta be a good sign. We were very optimistic 40 years ago today. But there's more. Back to the DeLorean. We want to push ahead 10 years. Imagine that it's April 10th, 1995. It's 2 weeks until the celebration of now the 25th Earth Day. Quarter century of Earth Days have built up by this time. It's been 3 years since the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development convened in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 117 nations. Pretty much the globe came together, sending representatives to Rio for what's now called the Earth Summit. sent them to start talking about at the international level, what are we going to do? How are we going to cooperate and address the problems of climate and environment and pollution and all of the terms we associate with it? And 3 years ago, that happened, if we are in April of 1995. It's already been a few years since that happened. And in fact, April 10th, 1995, 30 years ago today, it's been 3 days since the close of the first Congress of Parties summit. When you hear on the news, and we hear it a lot, COP this, COP that, COP 15, COP 21, COP 29, this is the very first. It took 3 years after the Rio summit to put this together in ongoing international dialogue. But the first one happened in 1995, just a few days before April 10th, it closed. It was held in Berlin, and it was presided over by, as you see there, a relatively young Angela Merkel, who was at that time a legislator in the German Bundestag, later went on to be Chancellor of Germany. But the ball was rolling, the ball was moving. And that's probably how we would label the mood for April of 1995. There's momentum. That optimism is being parlayed into actual movement. There's an ongoing, coordinated international effort, international forum of nations that are trying to address what we know to be a fairly grave and threatening problem. Things are looking positive. But that is home, Doc, Marty McFly says. We go up to today. It is today, April 10th, 2025. The number one song on Spotify, can anybody guess? I never heard of it. It's Lady Gaga and Bruno Mars. I've never heard it. In fact, I've never logged into Spotify. I'm not sure I would know how, but it indicates, yes, it's a different time. It's not We Are the World. It's 2 weeks until the 55th celebration of Earth Day. 55th Earth Day since 1970, April 22nd, 1970. Although it's kind of bleached now, as a lot of people don't even know it's Earth Day. It's kind of fallen out of popular discussion. You get a few acknowledgments, social media, weirdos like me may say, yeah, it's Earth Day. Remember, it's Earth Day. But, we ignore weirdos like me and the others. So Earth Day is not such a big thing anymore, unfortunately. We don't see it as a day where we can all come together and say, hey, let's work on this. It's been 5 months since the close of COP29. So those COP meetings, Congress of Parties meetings in different locations have been progressing, have been happening every year. Last year was the 29th year since the first one in 1995. Last year it was in Baku, Azerbaijan. And it was kind of unusual. It was the second year in a row. First year, the year before was United Arab Emirates, COP28. 2 years in a row, the COP meetings were held in oil-rich petrostates, which would have been relatively unimaginable early on in 1995. The goal is to unhinge from fossil fuels, convert the economy to renewable energy. And here, 2 years in a row, where we are in oil-rich petrostates to hold these meetings. 5 months ago, right around the same time, pretty big switch in policy by major banks. Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, and several other large banks withdrew from the net zero CO2 emissions, or what they're referring to, net zero banking alliance. So around 2019, you might remember before COVID, there was a flurry of even corporate organizational concern. Yes, there's something we got to do something about it. We all have to step up. We all have to change things. We have to change our institutions. And the banking industry said, hey, we are guilty of this too. We need to gear our energy, our sights toward a net zero world, and we're going to do our part until 5 months ago. And all of those banks started pulling out. And right now, the Net Zero Banking Alliance is pretty much inert. It changed. It's been 1 month since the annual CERAWeek conference. Some of us might have heard of this. CERAWeek happens every year. It is a conference of executives, typically, of the major energy companies. So that includes renewables, smaller companies, but certainly it includes the major fossil fuel producers. They come together, they plan on the future, they figure out, okay, how do we work together to make a transition to renewables? ostensibly. They say they're going to do that this year. It wasn't quite so much about that. When they closed a month ago, we committed to what we now call a sober-minded pragmatism regarding the transition to renewables. If it was hopeful before, it's no longer hopeful. It's a sober-minded pragmatism regarding the conversion to renewable energy. And yeah, we have to admit that was probably prompted by the election in the United States, a leading energy consuming country, prompted by a candidate whose slogan was drill, baby, drill. You know, he's very much in support of the oil and fossil fuel industry. And just as he anticipated, just as he predicted he would, and we anticipated, he pulled us out of the Paris Agreement and the emissions reduction standards brought about by the Paris Agreement in 2015. And I know that's another one of these international conventions you hear about on the news, and it all sounds like gobbledygook. But think of this: the Paris Agreement was COP21, the 21st of those COP meetings. It was the first to set real standards, real goals that internationally we would try to meet. So that has been our guiding light for the past 10 years, those goals set in Paris in 2015. And just as he did in his first term, President Trump has pulled us out of that agreement. So we're not even paying attention to that right now. Interesting quote from one person at that meeting. We're seeing some reality come back into the conversation, says Chevron CEO Mike Wirth at the CERAWeek convention, as quoted by the New Republic, reality. So the hope, the momentum, the training of years ago, it's starting to fizzle out. We're talking about reality now. And in a somewhat different sense of the term reality, it's been 3 days, just 3 days ago. Council on Foreign Relations published a paper authored by Varun Sivaram, a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Our approach to climate policy has failed. It's time for climate realism. We have that word again. Realism, pragmatism, realism. Our sights are changing. We're looking at reality now. Now, to his credit, I've read the paper. It's actually a very lucid and very sober paper, and I would qualify it that the whole initiative that the Council on Foreign Relations has introduced here is using realism in a slightly different sense from, say, an oil company executive for whom realism is the bottom line, profit margins and shareholder values, things like that. They're saying realism, Council on Foreign Relations says we're entering an age of realism in the sense that we have to scale back our expectations. We have to accept that there is a crisis looming, but we also have to accept that there needs to be other approaches, maybe more practical approaches to avert the worst case scenarios. So that means things like, well, we might still need to reduce CO2, the most pervasive of the greenhouse gases that causes global warming, that causes climate change. We do need to reduce that. But the struggle for many years, and certainly the struggle of the COP meetings, has been changing these proportions. We have a little bit devoted to renewable energy like solar and a lot invested in fossil fuels, and we've been trying to reverse that. And that's been the goal of climate policy for the last couple of decades. Climate realism says, well, that's not going to be enough. And may be right. At some point, we have to look more closely at efforts to capture carbon once emitted. And there's already an emerging industry of carbon capture. People are investing in it simply because we have to admit there's going to be a certain amount we can't reduce in time to stave off worst case scenarios. You can't turn the ship around at this point that quickly. So we have to look at other means of taking carbon that is released, CO2 that is released, and sequestering it, pulling it out of the atmosphere. It also means, yeah, even for the carbon, the CO2, we can't sequester, we can't take from the atmosphere. We have to mitigate its effects. So if we can't reduce it, we can't capture it, we can develop industries that try to lessen its effects on the planet. In general, those are called geoengineering efforts, literally engineering the earth. And particularly scary as it sounds, yeah, we're talking about engineering the way the planet works. Most common of these is albedo enhancement, which this little diagram depicts here. If you can reflect sunlight off away from a planet that is still spewing CO2 and can't capture it, if you can at least reflect sunlight away, it limits the heat, it limits the buildup of heat. These industries, according to this climate realist approach, will have to really be invested, and we'll have to put our resources behind these as well, in addition to capture, in addition to reduction. And in the final count, climate realism suggests we might have to admit defeat. We still work at it, but we might have to admit defeat and say we're going to have to learn how to adapt to life on a warmer planet. So we hear all those worst case scenarios. Those are still going to happen, according to climate realism. They're still going to happen. And of course, not everybody's going to be as thrilled about it as this little animated family here who finds more beach days. People will suffer and people will die. And climate realism says what we have to do now is minimize the suffering and adapt to a warmer planet. Are they right? Well, they're smart people, Council on Foreign Relations, and these industries are already taking off. But being hopeful people, Franciscans, we do want to cling to that notion that we can at least turn the ship around a good degree to the point where we can reduce carbon, or we can reduce greenhouse gases and actually make a change. So we don't have to cause suffering, additional suffering to people, unnecessary suffering. So that's the state of the world right now. How do you capture the mood? I don't know. Is it resignation to the inevitable? In a sense, it is. We know the worst case scenarios are still quite possible. We know scenarios that we hoped 20, 30, 40 years ago would not come about, will come about, and they are coming about. Island nations will be submerged. Coastal cities will be submerged. That's going to happen, and we know that. Are we okay with this? That's our question tonight. Things have not changed in the measures of how bad this is. Fossil fuel consumption, you would think, at that point of optimism, you would think, oh, well, we would change the way we consume fossil fuels at least, and we plateau. No, it hasn't changed. In this whole period, 1970, that was the first Earth Day, I remember. What happened with oil, gas, and coal? Well, it kept going up. 1992, that Rio summit that I mentioned kept going up, still goes up. In fact, the only dinks, the only little crevices, the only drops were the temporary ones imposed by outside forces. The global financial crisis took a little toll on fossil fuel consumption in 2008, 2009, and of course, COVID did. And it recovered. And we are still on the rise, despite the fact that we've known this is deadly for decades now. And by extension, the rise in temperature continues to increase. This is just since 1880. And this is just that 40-year period that we've been talking about since 1985. Hasn't changed, hasn't gone down. We heard last year it was the warmest year on record. And what year did it beat? The year before, 2023. We are having consecutive serial warmest years on record now. And you might recall hearing that last year we actually did reach 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels, an average of 1.5 degrees. And we only hit it 1 year. But if that average is sustained, we will experience the worst case scenarios that climate scientists have anticipated. So if this continues at this rate, at 1.5 degrees, we are in for some dire times. And the sorry thing is, we know they're coming, and we knew they're coming, and we haven't really changed a lot. Gotta ask, how are we still facing this 40 years later? More than that, really. It's 55 since the first Earth Day. It's about a century since we know that CO2 and other greenhouse gases contribute to the warming of the planet. This is old knowledge. Is it climate denialism? And it's easy to point in our political climate to the fact that, yeah, our current president denies that there is a problem. Our current president denies the science. Yes, that's all true. Is that the sole source of our problems? I don't think so. It's been around a while. Those of us who follow politics closely remember Senator James Inhofe, a Republican of Oklahoma, about 10 years ago, brought a snowball into the Senate to demonstrate he thought that global warming must be a hoax because, hey, I can bring a snowball into the Senate. Denialism and this sort of odd head in the sand denialism that they represent, it's been there, but it's not the sole source of the problem. In fact, that head in the sand thing is probably something we're all a little prone to. Even those of us who say, oh, I accept the science, I know there's a crisis coming, I know we need to do something. It's very easy for us to deny it in our day-to-day life. We've all settled into a little bit of a kind of a benign denialism. Not that we doubt the science, not that we claim this is all a hoax. We don't. If you're watching this now, you probably don't claim it's a hoax, or you're in the wrong place. When the headlines are something other than those wildfires, or something other than the heat waves, or something other than hurricanes, like they are now, climate, despite the existential threat it imposes on us, is low on our priorities. It drops out very rapidly and very profoundly. And in a sense, we're all in denial about that. We can wake up each morning and know there is an existential crisis at hand. And yet we go about our day and read the other headlines and worry about other things. And the sorry thing, the sad thing is there's nothing wrong with that. We do have lives to live. And there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, I got other things I got to worry about right now. That's the dilemma here. That sort of benign denialism is life, and there's nothing wrong with living life. But I think we can do better, and that's why we're here. That's why you're listening to me prattle on. Think of the impending crisis as a consequence of try to capture it in a single problem, but a single problem that can be expressed multiple ways. There's many problems here, of course, but I want to talk about one, and it's understandable in three ways, I think. One way to say it is we fail to, as the subtitle of this talk suggests, we fail to think globally, act locally. That's a slogan, and a lot of us may not be familiar with that. So in just a minute, I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means and where it comes from. But that is a good way to capture what's going on. We're not doing that. We're not thinking globally, acting locally. Another way to say it, we've invested everything in government and corporate change. We've put all our chips into the notion of get the countries together to set these standards, and everything is working above us at the institutional level. And it kind of leaves us outside. So we feel, I don't have to do anything. COP20 something is going to be happening soon. People who think about these things are going to hash out, but they're going to sit around the table, they're going to hash out policies, all will be well. That's not a healthy way to think about it. Maybe the most concise way is we really haven't heard Pope Francis's message in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. We've ignored the message. We've resisted changing ourselves, and that's necessary. And we've resisted changing the world at the systemic level. So what does that mean? Think globally, act locally. It is quite literally a line from the early Green movement in the 80s. And quite literally, it's a bumper sticker. You can get bumper sticker. I had a pin that said, think globally, act locally. You can wear that. And it conveyed a message that, well, we should be aware of problems at the planetary level, at the international level. But the most effective action, or at least one very effective action, is to address them locally through our neighbors, through our communities, and through our own lifestyles. And that was certainly true of the environmental movement, that you change your lifestyle if you want to change the system. And I think it's still good advice. It was advice from the 1980s, even 1970s. I think it still stands today. We just don't heed it. We need to consider the problem of climate change at multiple levels, not just the institutional level, not just government and corporations that we've been focusing on. And we need to act where we personally can be most effective. But you might ask, what do you mean levels? What are you talking about? Well, it's a very social scientific concept, but it's not, excuse me, it's not out of our grasp. It's Pretty simple and pretty straightforward. There, as a social scientist would say, we have different levels of social transformation, different levels of society, and therefore social transformation. At one level, we have at the top, we have systemic, we have systems and systemic change. We have institutions below that, and we have personal lifestyle characteristics, individual. And each of these has its own opportunities. Each of these imposes its own limits. At the highest level, it's economic, political, cultural horizons, worldviews, isms, for example, capitalism, communism, the big ways of capturing ways of life and organizing institutions and people under them. Beneath them, we have those institutions, whatever the organizing system, way of thinking might be, governing bodies, corporations, churches, universities, healthcare systems, all of those things are institutional level. They have their own opportunities at social change and their own limitations. And at the base, we have us, consumers, consumer behavior, how we behave politically, whether we participate at all, our psychological dispositions, those play into it as well. So we have these three levels. You might ask, well, why are they a pyramid? Why not just a rectangle? Well, when you think about it, as you go up, the variety, the options decrease. We don't have that many systems. We have a handful of them, and that kind of makes sense. And beneath that, we have multiple institutions, but not quite as many as persons. There are 8 billion people on the planet right now. We don't have 8 billion institutions, and your life doesn't need to be governed by your own set of institutions, fortunately, let alone it's your own system. The system contains, various systems contain institutions, and they contain us. So as you go up, it gets narrower. As you go down, it gets wider. Lots of options. There is, in 2025, there is no vegetarian nation in the world, but there are lots of vegetarians throughout the world. Vegetarianism right now is a personal lifestyle thing. It's not a systemic thing. So you get the point. How does this apply to climate change? Well, I think what I've been insinuating here is we've been operating at the institutional level alone. And it's not that the institutional level is unimportant. It's part of a larger complex. We've been focusing most of our attention on the international agreements, COP meetings. And as I said, as individuals, we say, well, the pros are taking care of this. We don't need to do anything. That may not be right. At the individual personal lifestyle level, and when it comes to climate, we have this dilemma. We all ask ourselves, what difference can I make? What difference can I do? I didn't cause this problem unilaterally, and I cannot solve it unilaterally. So unilaterally, what do you need from me? That's a perfectly valid question, and it's stymied a lot of folks into whether or not they're going to do anything is their question. And at the systemic level, this, of course, is even more elusive because we don't know much about how things change at the systemic level, or maybe better put, there are lots of disputes about how things change at the systemic level. Do political systems, economic systems, worldviews, do they change because things below them are changing and they convert? Or do you change them from the top down by revolution? And of course, we know there are a lot of people out there who think, oh, it has to be done by revolution. If you want to make profound social change, you got to change it from the top. Now, that's a crude way of saying something that I think is more nuanced and more important for us. That question of what is to be done, the question of do we need a revolution, that's not just a political question. Lenin made it a political question, of course, and Lenin had his own methods, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had their own deplorable methods for perpetuating their revolution. But it's a historical question too, and it's a sociological, social question. And Marx himself was probably more nuanced about it than anybody who operates in his name. Marx was asking the question, how does social change happen? How do things change at the systemic level? Marx, for all intents and purposes, in a nutshell, says you want change, you got to transform it at the systemic level. You got to change things at the systemic level, politics, economics, culture, people, beliefs, even religion. They'll follow suit. They'll change, but you can't change people in order to change the system. You have to change systems. and hope and aspire that people will change accordingly. And of course, there's a lot of criticism of that. Many people disagree with that, but even among Marx's own allies, Mikhail Bakunin was a 19th century Russian anarchist, once a friend of Marx, and later had a falling out with him because he had the opposite view. He said, no, Karl, give me 5 minutes with every peasant in the Russian countryside. You'll have your revolution. In other words, we start from the ground. We start by changing people, inspiring them, converting them. And that change moves up through the institutions and it moves up into the systems. So that disagreement has been with social theory for centuries now. The question, what is to be done, as Lenin phrased it, is in large part the same question as how did we get where we are? Because if we are trying to achieve social transformation, and we believe we need social transformation if we're to avert a climate crisis, or one worse than we have now, if we really believe that, we have to be able to ask, well, how did we get where we're at right now? And that's going to be the focus for our last part, the remainder of this discussion. I wanted to talk about, it's in the title, with the limits to personal action. There's a lot invested in saying you need to change the way you live. Pope Francis says you need to change the way you live. Well, what does that mean? Laudato Si. Did we read this passage closely? Did this one come up in all of our discussions? The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes such as those which even now periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. It's a beautiful document, Laudato Si, but we got to face it. There are indictments of the way we live in Western developed nations there. And this isn't breaking news. This has been around long before Francis. Secular environmentalists, economists have been saying for years that the consumerism that we've been engaging in Western developed nations is harmful to ourselves, harmful to the planet, harmful to society. Juliet Shore, Herman Daly, we've published many books on this. But oddly enough, it's that same consumer that's been called upon to get us out of the situation. Because for every condemnation of our consumer lifestyles, including Pope Francis's condemnation, we have this legacy of simple things you can do to save the planet. It's been portrayed as very easy. And we have seen these little flyers and brochures and pamphlets, placemats in restaurants. This is all familiar. People have told apps, lots of apps. People have told us there are simple things you can do to change, to save the planet. Have they worked? Well, apparently not. We are where we are. We have the crisis situation that we're looking at. That level of 1.5 that was set in 2015, even by 2018, IPCC said, we're going to hit that. We're going to hit that easily. Why haven't they worked? Well, I want to consider in closing here, our last few moments, some of the problems I think we have. Number one, our priorities on what we can do individually, they're very easily confused and conflated. We're not quite sure what we can do. Rank the following in the order of effectiveness. If we had an open forum here, this is fun to kind of get people's different feedback on this and see where we are as a group. We can do that in a webinar format. So I'll ask you just to think it through as a thought experiment. Write it down if you want. I'll give you 4 options. Recycle single-use plastic. Reduce consumption of livestock. Curb your diet over more to a plant-based. Reduce food waste. Lastly, switch to wind power. If you were to rank those and how effective they are in, as we say, lowering your carbon footprint, what would you put first? What would you put second? What would you put third? And what would you put last? And I'm going to give you the answer right away for interest of time. Wind power is number 1. Reducing food waste, oddly enough, that's up there pretty high. Not many people know that. Reducing consumption of livestock. So the more plant-based your protein is in your diet, the better it is ecologically. And at a distant, very distant last is recycling single-use plastic. Is single-use plastic a problem? Oh, yeah. Is your recycling it going to solve the world's problems? Not at all. I have to ask, how many people do you know that would have ranked these accurately, at least according to the Drawdown Institute that came up with this example? How many would have been similar? How close would you have come to other people? We're all over the board with these things. We're told we can change the world individually, but how do we know? Virtue. The second problem, easily purchased. It's very easy to make ourselves feel good about what we're doing, even if we're not doing anything. And recycling is probably the best example of that. 82% of households in the US separate waste materials for recycling. You probably all do. Everybody here does. Only 21% of that material is actually recycled. And it's even worse for plastic. Less than 10% of that single-use plastic that we separate, that doesn't get recycled. These are according to the EPA and to the website Plastic Recycling Facts. We pat ourselves on the back when we separate our waste, recyclable waste, but that's an end in itself. It's mostly about patting ourselves on the back. It doesn't accomplish much of anything environmentally. We feed that blue beast, the recycling bin. Now, what happens after that? Well, we hope things are made from it. And Nike does indeed produce a recyclable, a shoe made from recycled materials. And that's pretty rare because that doesn't happen much. This is far more common. It gets bundled, and especially the plastic, it gets bundled and sent off to some other part of the world. The world market, and I emphasize market, this is a market. There is no grand scheme commission that coordinates recycling around the world and makes sure that what you separate is going to get recycled. Somebody has to buy it. Somebody has to say it's worth it for me to buy this as raw material for something, and that market just isn't there. So we ship it off. It used to be about a third of it would go to China and end up sitting in a harbor looking like this. Now it's Malaysia. When Malaysia says, I want it no more, who's going to be the next? The net effect of all this is not recycling, but downcycling, as it's called. We increase the use of single-use plastics just by virtue of the fact that, well, I'm going to recycle it. I'm going to separate it. It's not going to get recycled, but we end up using more plastic. And we're still oblivious as to where everything goes. You might remember, if you're old enough to remember, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, part of the whole ecology movement was to attune us to the planet, to be able to say, I know where my resources are coming from and I know where my waste is going. I am more aligned with the planet. That's what ecology was in those early days. Now, what do? We approach it. It was, okay, which hole does this go into? And we walk away. We're no more invested in where it goes than we were before when it was all landfilled. It's still out of sight and out of mind. One commentator quite aptly described it. In our collective rush to make choices that display personal virtue, we may be losing sight of the larger picture. Quickly here, consequences. They're easily exported. We think we're suffering the consequences of our actions. We're not. We send them overseas. This is how we picture pollution. And this is how the American landscape, the industrial landscape, looked at one time. Not much so anymore. But this is pollution no less than the smokestacks. That sleek smartphone that we have and we charge causes emissions, causes pollutions. We just don't see it. We don't feel it. We don't smell it. It might be better if Apple designed the iPhone so that a little puff of smoke came out every time we charge it, just to remind it that this is not problem-free. This is still the product of a process that pollutes, that puts people in danger, that causes CO2 emissions. All current production of even clean energy entails some pollution. Solar panels, wind turbines, stuff of renewable energy. Yeah, that's heavy industry that has to make those. We look at a wind farm off the shore. There's a nice one off the shores of the UK, blue skies, blue water, pleasant to look at. This is where they come from. You want to build the parts? You got to do heavy industry, a lake of toxic waste in Baotou, China. This is where the parts of solar panels and wind turbines are made. Toxic waste, gathering, forming their own lakes. Batteries, same thing. That's another good example. Lithium is needed. Other rare earth minerals are needed for the batteries of our sleek, seemingly clean appliances and electronics. Well, if you want lithium, it's heavy industry. You gotta extract it from salt water, or you gotta mine for it. Current lithium extraction requires disruption of communities as well. We are upending Chilean communities, other South American communities, so that corporations can go in there and mine and gather the lithium that we need for our cell phone batteries and our various other batteries. Some speculation that was even behind the coup in Bolivia in 2019. Evo Morales was not on board with the commercialization of lithium. He wanted to nationalize it for Bolivia. They said, adios, Evo. And this is not going to change anytime soon with clean energy. In fact, this is the definition of clean energy. The growing demand for these minerals and the industrial production it takes to get them is part of our sustainable development future. This isn't going to change. Lastly, unilateral action, very easily thwarted. What can we do by ourselves? Hard to say. For example, you decide to switch to wind power tomorrow. Now what? What are you going to do? Remember, it was the number one out of those four. It's the best thing you can do. But what do you do? So you got your house, you got your garage behind you, you got a little plot of land, some space in between. You put up a wind turbine all by yourself, hang a little bird feeder on it. You could. That's not very effective. And in fact, there are wind turbines for household use. You can try to power yourself, but that's not going to solve the problem. We need to change the source of energy going into the grid that we plug into. And that means we have to have a lot of these in place. Some individual consumer actions that we're encouraged to take are only possible if there's already institutional and maybe even systemic changes in place. Things up here have to change, a la Marx. Things up here have to change before we as individuals can do certain things. Take driving. How many times have you been encouraged to drive less for the sake of the environment? Sounds easy. You just limit the number of miles you're on the road, but it's not very easy if you don't live in an area that has decent public transportation or even sidewalks. A lot of suburbs and exurbs are built without sidewalks now. You can't even walk to where you're going. And that's not something you can retrofit easily. It has to go into the urban planning. Structural, systemic changes have to be in place in order for us to make personal changes in many cases. Not all cases, but in many cases. So how are we doing here, wrapping up systemic, institutional, personal? Well, as I said, this is underway. We've been working at this at the institutional level for a long time, for years, but it can't be the only vehicle. We have to consider what do we need to change at the systemic level, and can it change? Will it change quickly enough? Down at the personal level, at what point does mass personal transformation become systemic change? We don't have the answer to that. It's an open question, open to experiment. How much of this has to go up the grid? How much of this has to go down? Is there a case for systematic change? Yes, we have to change the system. A single factoid can convey that fossil fuel producers are still collecting $20 billion a year in tax money. We're still paying people to produce fossil fuels. Half of all the new oil and gas ventures would be unprofitable without those. This isn't a climate, pardon the pun, this isn't a climate where our individual actions are going to make all that much of a difference. We have to change things at the systemic level. Changing my lifestyle, my personal ecological transformation doesn't bring about by itself personal social transformation. It has to be us. It has to be collective action. The question is, how many minds are in us? How many of us have to be on board with this before it's effective? Pope Francis, nevertheless, self-improvement on the part of individuals will not by itself remedy the extremely complex situation facing our world today. Social problems must be addressed by the community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. I won't read the rest. You can go back and look at the recording. You can read Laudato Si and get the full quote there. Romano Guardini quotes heavily in there. So it has to be some systemic change. Pope Francis is telling us it's not just you alone. But still, there is a case for personal transformation. There is no techno fix that will systemically change everything if we maintain the same consumption habits. It can't be done. There's no scenario that can describe that. There's no path to a carbon neutral world, certainly not over the next 20, 25 years, that doesn't require a change in the way we consume our lifestyle habits in the Western developed world. There's no plan there without us changing. Systemic institutional change alone is ineffective unless we're willing to change the amount and the ways we consume. There has to be systemic change. There has to be personal change. Both of those are necessary. And there's a couple of, I want to wrap up here so we can have at least a little bit of time for a little longer. Have a little bit of time for questions. A couple of quotes, but I think we're already familiar with these. We know Pope Francis is asking for personal transformation. That's the crux of it. But I wanted to emphasize the context here. He's saying personal transformation, caring for creation, absolutely indispensable, but it's in that larger context of a need for institutional and systemic change.